David had been dreaming about this moment for years. Standing in front of his new house with the keys in his hand felt almost unreal. After working countless overtime shifts at the hospital, saving every extra dollar and dealing with mountains of paperwork, he finally did it. He was a homeowner. The house wasn't anything fancy. It was a modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood called Oakwood Heights. The lawn needed some work and the paint could use a fresh coat, but it was his. No more paying rent to some landlord who took weeks to fix a leaky faucet. No more paper-thin walls where he could hear his neighbors arguing at 2 a.m. This was home. David worked as a nurse in the emergency room at County General Hospital. His shifts were long and unpredictable, sometimes running 12 or 14 hours when things got busy. He'd seen it all during his 7 years there. The job was exhausting, but he loved helping people. And now, after all that hard work, he finally had something to show for it. The neighborhood seemed perfect when he first visited. Tree-lined streets, well-kept houses, and friendly waves from people walking their dogs. The HOA rules seemed reasonable enough when he read through them. Keep your lawn trimmed. Don't paint your house weird colors, and bring your trash cans in on time. Simple stuff that any decent neighbor would do anyway. But David's excitement started to fade on his very first day in the house. He was carrying boxes from his truck when he noticed something odd. There was a silver Mercedes parked right in his driveway, not pulled up near the curb, but actually in his driveway, taking up the whole space where he needed to park his own car. At first, he thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone from the moving company or a delivery person. He waited a few minutes, expecting someone to come out and move it. Nothing happened. The car just sat there with its fancy rims gleaming in the afternoon sun. David ended up parking on the street and continued unloading his stuff. He figured whoever owned the car would come back soon and realize their error. Hours passed. The sun started setting, and that Mercedes was still sitting in his driveway like it owned the place. Finally, around 7 p.m, he saw a woman walking up the street toward the car. She was probably in her late 50s, wearing expensive-looking yoga clothes and designer sunglasses. She had that particular walk that some people have, like they expect the world to move out of their way. "Excuse me?" David called out, trying to keep his voice friendly. "Is this your car?" The woman barely looked at him. "Yes, it is." "Oh, well, this is actually my driveway. I just moved in today and I need to park my truck here." She finally turned to face him, pulling her sunglasses down just enough to look him up and down. "I'm Patricia from the HOA board. I live 3 houses down." She pointed vaguely up the street. "I've been parking here for the last 2 years while the house was empty. It's more convenient for me when I have HOA business to attend to." David blinked, not quite sure he'd heard her right. "But I live here now. I need my own driveway." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "You can park on the street. There's plenty of room. I'll only be using the driveway a few times a week." "Wait, what?" "No, this is my property. I need you to park somewhere else." "Look," Patricia said, her voice taking on an edge of annoyance. "I'm very busy with HOA responsibilities. This is much more convenient for me, and it's not like you're paying extra for a driveway spot. Just use the street parking like everyone else does when they have guests over." Before David could respond, she got in her Mercedes and drove away, leaving him standing there completely confused. Did that really just happen? Did this woman seriously just tell him she was going to keep parking in his driveway? He thought maybe it was just a weird first interaction, that she'd realize how ridiculous her request was and stop. But he was wrong. 3 days later, he came home from a brutal shift at the hospital to find that silver Mercedes sitting in his driveway again. This time it had been there so long there was a parking ticket on the windshield from the city, because technically the car was blocking the sidewalk. David took the ticket off and walked down to Patricia's house. He knocked on her door, and when she answered, he held up the ticket. "Your car got a ticket in my driveway," he said, trying to keep his cool. Patricia took the ticket and glanced at it. "Well, that's ridiculous. I'll get it dismissed. My son-in-law is a lawyer. That's not the point. You can't keep parking in my driveway. I'm asking you nicely to please stop." "I heard you the first time," Patricia said. "And I told you it's not a problem. Just park on the street." "It is a problem. It's my driveway. I paid for this house. You don't have permission to park there." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure you can actually afford this house? The last owner was very accommodating. Maybe you're just not used to how things work in a nice neighborhood like this." David felt his jaw tighten. There it was, that tone. That subtle suggestion that he didn't belong. He'd heard it before in different forms throughout his life, but it never stopped stinging. "I can afford my house just fine," he said firmly. "What I can't afford is having someone block my driveway when I need to get to work. Please don't park there again." He walked away before she could respond, his heart pounding. He knew getting angry wouldn't help anything. But Patricia didn't stop. Over the next 2 weeks, it got worse. She started parking there almost every single day. Sometimes she'd leave her car there for just an hour or two. Other times it would sit there overnight. One morning, David woke up late for his shift and found her car blocking his garage door. He had to call his supervisor and explain why he'd be late, which was embarrassing and unprofessional. He tried everything he could think of. He left polite notes on her windshield asking her to stop. He called her phone number, which he got from the HOA directory. He even tried talking to other people on the HOA board, but they seemed reluctant to get involved. One board member told him it was just a neighbor disagreement and they should work it out like adults. David felt like he was going crazy. How was this even a debate? It was his property. He wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. He just wanted to be able to park in his own driveway at the house he'd worked so hard to buy. The worst part was seeing Patricia around the neighborhood, acting like nothing was wrong. She'd wave at other neighbors, chat about the weather, and smile like she was the sweetest person in the world. But every time she saw David, her expression would turn cold. One evening, David sat on his front porch after another long shift, looking at that silver Mercedes sitting in his driveway once again. His truck was parked on the street nearly a block away because all the close spots were taken. He was tired. His feet hurt. His back ached from lifting patients all day, and he just wanted to park in his own driveway. That's when David realized something important. Being polite wasn't working. Asking nicely wasn't working. Going through the HOA wasn't working. If he wanted this to stop, he was going to have to do something different. Something that Patricia would actually pay attention to. He pulled out his phone and started researching property laws and trespassing rights. If Patricia wanted to play games, he'd play too. But he'd play by the rules and he'd make sure he won. David spent the next few days doing something he'd never thought he'd have to do. He started documenting everything. Every time Patricia parked in his driveway, he took photos with timestamps. He saved all the notes he'd left on her windshield. He kept records of every phone call, every text message, every attempt he'd made to resolve this peacefully. His coworker at the hospital, Jenny, noticed he seemed distracted during their break one day. When he explained what was happening, she just shook her head. "That's crazy. Have you thought about getting a lawyer?" David had thought about it, but lawyers were expensive. He'd just spent everything he had on the house. Still, Jenny had a point. Maybe a legal letter would scare Patricia into backing off. But things got worse before David could even make that call. One morning he walked out to his mailbox and found a letter from the HOA. His stomach dropped as he read it. According to the complaint, his trash cans were visible from the street for an extended period after collection day, violating the neighborhood aesthetic standards. He could be fined $50 if it happened again. David stood there staring at the letter in disbelief. He'd brought his trash cans in the same day as pickup, maybe an hour after the truck came by. He looked around at his neighbors' houses. 2 of them still had their trash cans out by the curb, and it was already late afternoon. Why wasn't anyone complaining about those? He didn't have to guess who'd filed the complaint. The letter was signed by Patricia Henderson, HOA board member. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This time it was about his doormat. Apparently the burgundy welcome mat he'd bought at Target was not in keeping with the approved color palette for exterior decorative elements. David had to read that sentence 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. His doormat was the wrong color. He walked around the neighborhood that evening, really looking at people's houses for the first time. He saw doormats in every color imaginable: black, red, blue, green. One house even had a bright yellow mat with a giant smiley face on it. But somehow his was the problem. The third complaint came a week after that. Patricia claimed his car was leaking oil on the street and creating an environmental hazard. David crawled under his car with a flashlight that same evening. Not a single drop of oil. His car was in perfect condition. He'd just had it serviced 2 months ago. That's when David started to understand what was really happening. This wasn't about parking anymore. This wasn't even about HOA rules. Patricia was trying to make his life so miserable that he'd give up and move away. He sat at his kitchen table that night, looking at all 3 complaint letters spread out in front of him. His phone rang. It was his mom calling for their weekly check-in. "How's the new house, baby?" she asked, her voice warm and familiar. David hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but he also needed someone to talk to. He told her everything. The parking, the complaints, all of it. His mom was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that stuck with him. "You know what this is, don't you? This is about who she thinks should be living in that neighborhood. She took one look at you and decided you don't belong. I've seen it 1,000 times." David wanted to argue, to say it couldn't be that simple. But deep down he knew his mom was right. He'd felt it in that first conversation with Patricia, in the way she'd asked if he could really afford the house. In the way she looked at him like he was an intruder rather than a neighbor. The next day at work, something happened that made everything even more clear. David was in the break room when he overheard 2 of the older nurses talking about Oakwood Heights. One of them mentioned that her cousin had looked at houses there a few years ago. "It's a nice neighborhood," she said. "But my cousin said some of the people there were, not very welcoming. She got a weird vibe during the open house, like they were surprised to see her there." David's ears perked up. "What do you mean?" The nurse looked a bit embarrassed. "Oh, I don't know if I should say. It's probably nothing. No, please. I live there now and I'm having some issues," she sighed. "Well, my cousin is Latina, and she said the real estate agent kept mentioning how exclusive the neighborhood was, how they had very particular standards. She felt like they were trying to hint that she wouldn't fit in. She ended up buying somewhere else." David felt his heart sink. This was bigger than just Patricia. This was a pattern. That weekend, David did something brave. He decided to talk to some of his other neighbors, the ones who weren't on the HOA board. He started with the house next door, where a young couple lived with their 2 kids. The husband, Tom, answered the door. David introduced himself properly for the first time, and they chatted for a few minutes about the neighborhood. Then David carefully brought up the HOA complaints. Tom's face changed. He glanced back into his house, then stepped outside and lowered his voice. "Look, I don't want to cause trouble, but yeah, Patricia can be intense. She filed a complaint against us last year because our son's basketball hoop was improperly positioned. It was literally in the same spot as 3 other basketball hoops on the street, but ours was the only one she had a problem with." "Did you notice anything else?" David asked. Tom hesitated. "My wife is Korean American. Patricia once asked her right in front of me where she was originally from. When my wife said Chicago, Patricia pushed and asked where she was really from. It was awkward as hell." David talked to 2 more neighbors that day. Both had stories. The family across the street, who'd moved from Mexico 5 years ago, mentioned that Patricia had called the police on their teenage son once, claiming he looked suspicious while he was literally mowing their lawn in broad daylight. Another neighbor, an older black gentleman who'd lived there for a decade, quietly told David that Patricia had opposed his home purchase back then, trying to convince other board members that his presence would change the character of the neighborhood. By Sunday evening, David had filled an entire notebook with information. Patricia had a history of targeting people who didn't look like her. The HOA had let her get away with it, because most people were too afraid to fight back, worried about fines or making their living situation worse. But here's the thing about David. He'd spent years in the emergency room dealing with high-pressure situations. He'd kept his cool when people were literally dying in front of him. He'd learned to think clearly under stress, to follow procedures, and to document everything for legal protection. Patricia had picked the wrong person to mess with. That night, David made a decision. He wasn't going to let Patricia bully him out of his home. He wasn't going to accept her parking in his driveway. And he definitely wasn't going to tolerate her discriminatory complaints. He pulled up his laptop and started researching. Property laws, trespassing statutes, HOA regulations, tenant rights. He read through his HOA bylaws again, this time looking for anything that might help him. He found sections about non-discriminatory enforcement of rules, requirements for how complaints should be filed and reviewed, rules about conflicts of interest when board members filed complaints. Patricia had been cutting corners, using her position to target people personally. And David was going to prove it. The next morning, David called a real estate attorney, The consultation cost him $200 he really couldn't spare, but it was worth it. The lawyer listened to his story, looked through his documentation, and gave him some very interesting advice. "You have options," the lawyer said. "First, her parking on your property without permission is trespassing. You have the legal right to have the vehicle removed. Second, these HOA complaints show a pattern of harassment. If you can prove selective enforcement, you might have grounds for a discrimination case." David took notes carefully. What should I do first? Send her a formal cease and desist letter. Make it official. If she parks there again after receiving legal notice, you're within your rights to have the car towed. Keep documenting everything, and start filing formal complaints with the HOA management company about her behavior. David left that office feeling something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope and determination. Patricia's silver Mercedes was parked in his driveway when he got home that evening. David looked at it and actually smiled. He pulled out his phone and took another photo, adding it to his growing collection. This time he wasn't going to leave a polite note. This time things were going to be different. The lawyer's letter arrived at Patricia's house 3 days later. David had paid extra for certified mail, so there'd be proof she received it. The letter was straightforward and professional. It explained that David was the legal owner of the property, that Patricia's continued parking constituted trespassing, and that any future violations would result in the vehicle being removed at the owner's expense. David thought that would be the end of it. A formal legal letter tends to make people take things seriously. He figured Patricia would finally realize she'd pushed too far and back off. He was wrong. The very next evening, David came home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital to find that silver Mercedes sitting in his driveway like always. But this time felt different. This time felt deliberate, like Patricia was testing him, like she was saying, "I got your little letter and I don't care." David sat in his truck for a moment, parked on the street, staring at her car. His whole body ached from being on his feet all day. He'd dealt with 3 trauma cases, a cardiac arrest, and a teenager who'd overdosed. He was exhausted, and he still couldn't park in his own driveway. But instead of getting angry, David felt something else. Calm. Clarity. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He pulled out his phone and called the towing company his lawyer had recommended. They specialized in private property removals and knew all the legal requirements. "I need a car removed from my driveway," David said. "The owner has been legally notified and is trespassing." "We can have someone there in 30 minutes, the dispatcher said. "We'll need to see your property deed and the cease and desist letter." "I have everything ready." David went inside, grabbed the documents, and made himself a sandwich. He sat on his front porch eating it, watching the street. Sure enough, 28 minutes later, a tow truck came rumbling down the road. The driver was a big guy named Ray with a gray beard and kind eyes. David showed him the paperwork, and Ray nodded approvingly. "You did everything right. Some people try to tow cars without proper documentation and it becomes a whole mess. But this is clean. How long will this take?" David asked. "About 10 minutes to hook it up." "Where's it going?" "The impound lot on Madison Avenue." "That's the one you use, right?" "Yep. It'll cost her about $600 to get it out. Towing fee, storage fees, processing. It adds up quick." David watched as Ray expertly maneuvered the tow truck into position. The mechanical arm extended. The hooks latched onto Patricia's Mercedes, and slowly the car lifted into the air. A few neighbors had come out to watch. David saw curtains moving and windows up and down the street. Everyone was curious about what was happening. Just as Ray was securing the car, Patricia came speed-walking down the sidewalk. Her face was red and she was practically running. "What are you doing?" she shrieked. "That's my car." "You can't take my car." Ray didn't even flinch. He'd clearly dealt with angry car owners before. "Ma'am, this vehicle is parked on private property without permission. The owner has requested removal." "I have permission," Patricia shouted, turning to David. "Tell him." David stayed calm, his voice steady. "You don't have permission. You received a legal cease and desist letter. You were warned this would happen." Patricia's eyes went wild. "This is theft. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Ray said, finishing up the securing straps. "We follow all legal procedures. The police will tell you the same thing I'm telling you. This is a legal tow." Patricia actually did call the police. 2 officers showed up about 15 minutes after the tow truck had already left. David was still sitting on his porch, finishing his sandwich and enjoying the evening air. The officers talked to Patricia first. David could hear her animated voice from where he sat, though he couldn't make out the words. Then one of the officers walked over to him. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" David explained the situation calmly. He showed the officer his property deed, the cease and desist letter, photos of Patricia's car parked in his driveway multiple times, and the documentation of all his previous attempts to resolve the situation peacefully. The officer looked through everything, then nodded. "You're well within your rights. This is your property and she was trespassing. The tow was legal. So, I can get my car back?" Patricia demanded, walking over. "Yes, ma'am, but you'll need to go to the impound lot and pay the fees. And I'd strongly suggest you don't park here again or the same thing will happen." Patricia looked like she was about to explode. Her face was purple and her hands were shaking. "This is discrimination. He's targeting me. I'm going to sue him. I'm going to have him kicked out of this neighborhood." The officer's expression hardened a bit. "Ma'am, from what I can see, you've been parking on his property for weeks despite being asked to stop. That's not discrimination. That's trespassing. I suggest you move along and resolve this at the impound lot." After the police left, Patricia stood on the sidewalk glaring at David for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call, speaking in a harsh whisper as she walked back toward her house. David went inside, feeling surprisingly good. He'd stood up for himself. He'd followed the rules, and for the first time since moving, and he felt like maybe he could actually win this battle. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. On day 1 after the tow, David got a notice from the HOA. There would be a special meeting to discuss neighborhood conduct violations. He wasn't specifically named, but he knew it was about him. On day 2, he found a note on his door from Patricia. It wasn't an apology. Instead, it was a printed copy of an obscure HOA rule about maintaining neighborly relations and resolving disputes through proper channels. She'd highlighted a section that suggested towing a neighbor's car could be considered aggressive behavior unbecoming of a community member. On day 3, David got another HOA letter. This one claimed his lawn was exceeding the maximum allowed grass height by 2 inches. He'd literally mowed it that weekend. He went outside and measured the grass with a ruler. It was well within the allowed height. But the complaint had been filed by Patricia, of course, and the HOA was threatening a $75 fine. David realized something important. Patricia wasn't going to accept this loss quietly. She was going to use every bit of power she had as an HOA board member to make his life miserable. The towing had humiliated her, and now she wanted revenge. That evening, David got a call from Tom, his neighbor. "Hey, I just wanted to give you a heads up. Patricia has been going around to different houses trying to get people to sign a petition against you. She's claiming you're creating a hostile environment in the neighborhood. Is anyone signing it? Some people are, honestly. They don't know the full story, and Patricia is good at making herself sound reasonable. But a few of us are on your side. We know what she's really like." After hanging up, David felt that familiar exhaustion creeping back in. He'd won one battle, but the war was far from over. Patricia had resources, time, and a position of power in the HOA. What did he have? A job that kept him busy 60 hours a week and a bank account that was already strained from lawyer fees and the house purchase. But David also had something Patricia didn't count on. He had documentation of everything. He had testimony from other neighbors about her discriminatory behavior, and he had a growing determination that he wasn't going to let her win. The special HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 p.m. David requested the night off from work. He spent the next few days preparing, printing out all his documentation, organizing his evidence, and even practicing what he wanted to say. He also did something else. He reached out to the other neighbors Patricia had targeted over the years. The family whose son had been reported as suspicious, the couple with the basketball hoop, the older gentleman who Patricia had tried to keep out of the neighborhood years ago. One by one, they agreed to come to the meeting with him. Thursday evening arrived. David put on his best shirt and tie, grabbed his folder of evidence, and walked to the community center where HOA meetings were held. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. Patricia was already there, sitting at the board table with two other board members, looking smug and confident. She clearly expected this to go her way. But when David walked in, followed by 6 other neighbors, all carrying their own folders of documentation, Patricia's smile faltered just a little bit. David took a seat in the front row and set his folder on his lap. The meeting was about to begin and he was ready. The meeting room was more crowded than usual. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something interesting was about to happen. People who normally never attended HOA meetings had shown up, filling the plastic chairs and lining the back wall. Patricia sat at the front table between 2 other board members, Richard and Linda. Richard was an older, retired accountant who mostly just went along with whatever Patricia wanted. Linda seemed uncomfortable, shifting in her seat and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Patricia called the meeting to order, her voice crisp and authoritative. She went through the usual boring stuff first. Minutes from the last meeting, budget updates, a discussion about repainting the neighborhood entrance sign. David could tell she was stalling, building up to the main event. Finally, she cleared her throat. Now we come to a more serious matter. We've received multiple complaints about aggressive and hostile behavior from one of our residents. Behavior that goes against the spirit of community and neighborly conduct that we value here in Oakwood Heights. She didn't say David's name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Several people turned to look at him. This resident, Patricia continued, has taken it upon himself to have a neighbor's vehicle towed without any attempt at friendly resolution. This kind of aggressive action creates division in our community and sets a dangerous precedent. David raised his hand. I'd like to respond to that. Patricia looked annoyed. This isn't a debate. This is a formal board review. Actually, Linda spoke up quietly. According to our bylaws, any resident being discussed has the right to address the board. Patricia shot Linda a look but nodded curtly. Fine. Keep it brief. David stood up, holding his folder. His heart was racing, but his voice came out steady. Patricia has been parking in my driveway repeatedly for over a month. I asked her politely to stop multiple times. I left notes, I called her. I tried going through proper HOA channels, nothing worked. She was sent a legal cease and desist letter by my attorney. Only after all of that did I have her car towed. So the claim that I didn't attempt friendly resolution is simply not true. He pulled out his documentation and held it up. I have photos, timestamps, copies of notes, phone records, everything. Would the board like to see them? Richard leaned forward. That won't be necessary. We believe you made your attempts. Hold on, Patricia interjected. The issue isn't whether he asked. The issue is the aggressive response. Towing someone's car is hostile behavior. It's also my legal right, David said. I own that property. After being warned repeatedly, she chose to continue trespassing. What was I supposed to do? Just accept someone parking on my property indefinitely? You could have come to the board, Patricia said. I did come to the board. I spoke to 3 different board members. Nothing happened. The room was silent. A few people nodded in agreement. Tom, David's neighbor, stood up. Can I say something? Patricia looked like she wanted to say no, but with so many people watching, she couldn't. Go ahead. Patricia filed a complaint against my family last year about our basketball hoop. The same style hoop that 4 other houses on our street have. But she only complained about ours. My wife is Korean American, and Patricia has made some really uncomfortable comments to her about where she's really from. This isn't about HOA rules. This is about who Patricia thinks belongs in this neighborhood. Another neighbor stood up. She called the police on my son for looking suspicious. He was mowing our lawn, in the middle of the day, in our own yard, then another. She tried to get me cited for having my trash cans out too long, but 3 of my neighbors had their cans out even longer and nobody said anything to them. One by one, people started sharing their stories. The room was filled with voices of neighbors who'd been quietly dealing with Patricia's behavior for years. David hadn't even asked them to speak up. They just did. Patricia's face had gone from confident to pale. She tried to regain control. This is turning into a witch hunt. These accusations are out of line, and frankly, they border on slander. They're not accusations if they're documented, David said. He walked up to the board table and laid out page after page of evidence. Photos, complaint letters, emails, witness statements. I've spent the last 2 weeks gathering all of this. Patricia has been selectively enforcing HOA rules against specific residents while ignoring the same violations by others. That's discrimination, and it's actually illegal. Richard picked up some of the papers and started reading. His expression changed as he went through them. Linda did the same, her eyes getting wider. "This is taken out of context," Patricia protested. "I've been serving this community for 8 years. I've given my time and energy to keeping this neighborhood beautiful and maintaining property values. By harassing people who don't look like you," David said. It came out harsher than he intended, but he was tired of dancing around the truth. Patricia stood up abruptly. "How dare you? I am not a racist. This is offensive and completely inappropriate." "Then explain the pattern," David said. "Explain why every person who's complained here tonight happens to be a person of color. Explain why you've never filed complaints against the violations you claim to care about when they're committed by your friends on this street." The room erupted in murmurs. People were talking to each other, looking at Patricia, looking at the documents on the table. Richard held up his hand for quiet. "I think we need to take a break and review all of this evidence more carefully. This is more complex than we initially understood." "There's nothing to review," Patricia snapped. "These people are ganging up on me because I hold them to the same standards as everyone else." "Really?" It was Mr. Johnson who spoke up, the older gentleman who'd lived in the neighborhood for a decade. "Because I remember very clearly when you tried to convince the board not to approve my home purchase 10 years ago. You said my presence would change the character of the neighborhood. I have the emails, Patricia. I kept them all these years." Patricia's face went from pale to bright red. "That was a decade ago and completely misunderstood. Was it?" Mr. Johnson pulled out his phone. "Should I read them out loud?" The room went dead silent. Everyone was staring at Patricia now. She looked around, realizing she'd lost the room. Her power, her authority, her carefully maintained image were all crumbling right in front of everyone. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced, gathering her papers with shaking hands. "You can't adjourn the meeting unilaterally," Linda said, finding her voice. "We need to vote on it." "I second that," Richard added. "And I think we need to schedule a special session to review board member conduct." "This is serious." Patricia looked between them, betrayed. "You're going to side with them over me? After everything I've done for this HOA? "We're not siding with anyone," Richard said. "We're following our responsibility to the community. If there's been selective enforcement of rules, that's a legal liability for all of us." Patricia grabbed her bag and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind her with a loud bang. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then people started talking all at once. Some were angry, some were relieved, some were just shocked at what had happened. David sat back down, feeling drained. Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, man. This needed to happen." "I just wanted to park in my driveway," David said with a tired laugh. "It became bigger than that," Mr. Johnson said, walking over. "You stood up. Most people don't. They just accept it and move on or move away. But you stood up and you gave the rest of us permission to do the same." David drove home that night feeling strange, relieved but also uncertain. He'd won something important tonight, but he knew Patricia wasn't going to just disappear. People like her didn't accept defeat gracefully. Sure enough, when he pulled onto his street, he saw it immediately. That silver Mercedes parked right in his driveway. Again, David actually laughed out loud. He sat there in his truck looking at that car and he couldn't help but laugh. Patricia was so stubborn, so determined to prove she was right, that she'd literally parked in his driveway the same night she'd been exposed in front of the entire neighborhood. He pulled out his phone and called Ray, the tow truck driver. "Hey Ray, it's David. Remember that Mercedes you towed last week? Well, I've got good news for you. She's back." Ray showed up 40 minutes later, shaking his head with a grin on his face. "She really parked here again? After everything that happened at the meeting tonight?" "Word travels fast," David said. "Small neighborhood. My wife's cousin lives 2 streets over. She texted me about the meeting before you even called." Ray walked around the Mercedes examining it. Some people just can't help themselves, you know? They'd rather be right than be smart. This time, a bigger crowd gathered to watch. It was almost 9 p.m., but lights were on in houses up and down the street. People came out onto their porches. A few walked over to watch up close. Nobody was even trying to be subtle about it anymore. Patricia must have been watching from her window because she came running out before Ray even had the car hooked up. But this time she wasn't alone. She had her phone out recording everything. "This is harassment," she shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm documenting this for my lawyer. This is the second time he's had my car illegally towed, and I'm going to sue him for everything he's worth." Ray didn't stop working. He'd heard it all before. David stayed calm. "Patricia, you were at the meeting tonight. You know you don't have permission to park here. This is the consequence. I have every right to park on this street." "On the street, yes. Not in my driveway. That's my property. This is because of what happened at the meeting. You're retaliating against me." David pulled out his phone and showed her his screen. "I texted you at 7:43 right after the meeting ended, reminding you not to park in my driveway. You read it at 7:45. Then you parked here anyway. That's not me retaliating. That's you making a choice." Several neighbors who were watching actually applauded. Patricia spun around, her face furious. "This is mob mentality. You're all ganging up on me." Mr. Johnson, who'd walked over to watch, spoke up in his calm, steady voice. "Patricia, you could have parked in your own driveway. You could have parked on the street. You chose to park in David's driveway again. This isn't about ganging up on anyone. This is about you refusing to respect someone else's property. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. Patricia's voice was getting shrill now. "I've served on the HOA board. I've organized community events. And this is how I'm treated? You've also made a lot of people feel unwelcome in their own homes," Tom added. He'd come out with his wife to watch. "Maybe it's time to think about that." Ray finished securing the car and climbed into his truck. "Ma'am, you can come get your car from the impound lot tomorrow. It'll be the same one as last time." As the tow truck pulled away with the Mercedes, Patricia stood in the street looking completely defeated. The confidence, the authority, the power she'd always carried around like a shield, it was all gone. She looked small and alone, standing there with her phone still in her hand. For a second, David almost felt bad for her. Almost. Then she turned to him with pure hatred in her eyes. "You haven't won. I'll make sure you regret this." "Patricia, I just want to park in my driveway and live peacefully in my house. That's all I've ever wanted." She stormed off without another word. The next 2 weeks were tense. Patricia did try to get her car back, but here's where things got interesting. Because she'd let it sit in the impound lot for 3 days. Apparently, she'd gone to stay with her daughter to avoid the hostile environment. The fees had piled up. Storage fees were $75 per day. By the time she finally went to get it, the total was over $1,500. According to Tom, who heard it from another neighbor, Patricia had a meltdown at the impound lot. She refused to pay, insisted the whole thing was illegal, and threatened to call the police again. The impound lot manager simply told her that if she didn't pay within 30 days, they'd auction the car to cover the fees. She paid. Meanwhile, the HOA was dealing with its own crisis. Richard and Linda, the other board members, had brought in the HOA management company to review everything. They looked at all the complaints Patricia had filed over the years, examined which ones had been legitimate and which ones showed a pattern of selective enforcement. The results weren't good for Patricia. The management company found multiple instances where she'd acted outside her authority, filed complaints without proper documentation, and enforced rules inconsistently. They also found that several of her official complaints had never actually been voted on by the full board. She'd just been making decisions on her own and slapping the HOA letterhead on them. The management company sent a letter to every homeowner explaining the situation and apologizing for the mismanagement. They announced that all complaints filed solely by Patricia over the past 2 years would be reviewed and potentially dismissed. They also implemented new policies requiring all complaints to be reviewed by the full board before any action was taken. Then came the big news. The management company recommended that Patricia be removed from the board for violations of her fiduciary duty and creating legal liability for the HOA. The board voted. It was unanimous. Patricia was out. She tried to fight it. She sent angry emails to everyone in the neighborhood. She posted on the community Facebook page about how she was being persecuted, but nobody was buying it anymore. Too many people had their own stories. Too much evidence had come to light. Within a month, Patricia put her house up for sale. David heard about it from Tom before he even saw the sign go up in her yard. "She's really leaving," Tom said, sounding almost surprised. "Good," David said simply. Do you think we were too hard on her? David thought about that question. He thought about all the times he'd tried to be polite, all the times he'd been patient, all the times he'd given her the benefit of the doubt. He thought about the other neighbors who'd suffered in silence for years. No, he said finally. I think we held her accountable. That's different. The house sold fast. Apparently, despite everything, Oakwood Heights was still a desirable neighborhood. David never spoke to Patricia again. He saw the moving trucks arrive one Saturday morning. By evening, she was gone. A month later, a young couple moved into Patricia's old house. David was mowing his lawn when they pulled up in their moving van. He waved and they waved back. The husband walked over, extending his hand. Hi, I'm Chris. This is my wife, Amy. David shook their hands, introduced himself. They chatted for a few minutes about the neighborhood, the HOA, the usual stuff. They seemed nice, normal. They didn't ask him where he was really from or whether he could afford to live there. By the way, Chris said, the previous owner left a note for the new buyers. It was really weird. It was a whole list of complaints about you and warnings to watch out for you. Just wanted you to know we threw it in the trash. Whatever drama was going on before, we're not interested. David laughed. I appreciate that. Let me know if you need any help moving in. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. David parked in his driveway every single day without incident. He joined the HOA board himself after a few months, wanting to make sure what happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. They revised the rules to be more clear and fair. They created a process for residents to appeal complaints. They made the whole system more transparent. The neighborhood actually became friendlier. Without Patricia stirring up trouble, people relaxed. Block parties became regular events. Neighbors who'd barely spoken before started looking out for each other. One evening, about 6 months after everything ended, David was sitting on his porch enjoying a beer after work. Mr. Johnson walked by with his dog and stopped to chat. You know what the best part of all this is? Mr. Johnson said. What's that? You made this neighborhood better just by refusing to be pushed around. A lot of people would have given up and moved, but you stood your ground and it changed things for everyone. David smiled. I just wanted to park in my driveway. Sometimes that's how it starts. One person saying enough is enough, then others find the courage to do the same. After Mr. Johnson walked on, David sat there thinking about everything that had happened. The frustration, the anger, the stress, the legal fees, all of it. Was it worth it? He looked at his driveway, empty and waiting for him whenever he needed it. He thought about the neighbors who'd thanked him for speaking up. He thought about the changes in the HOA that would protect future residents. Yeah, it was worth it. David finished his beer and went inside his house. His house. The one he'd worked so hard for. The one where he could finally park in his own driveway without someone else's car blocking his way. Sometimes the smallest victories are the most meaningful. And sometimes standing up for something as simple as your right to park in your own driveway can spark changes that ripple through an entire community. Patricia learned an expensive lesson. Literally. 2 towing fees, HOA removal, and having to sell her house and move away, all because she couldn't accept that David had just as much right to live there as she did. And David. He learned that documentation, persistence, and staying calm under pressure could win against someone with more power and connections. He learned that he wasn't alone, that other people were watching and waiting for someone to stand up first. Most importantly, he learned that home isn't just about 4 walls and a roof. It's about being able to exist in your space without constantly having to prove you belong there. His silver Mercedes-free driveway stood as a daily reminder of that truth.